Hey guys, GhazzyTV here with another Path of Exile build guide video. In this one, I'm going to talk about what I consider to be the best poison-related minion build in the current state of the game. No, it is not a Summon Raging Spirit build, it is a poison animate weapon. Now, the reason I deem this to be stronger than the very current popular SRS poison build is actually the fact that the animate weapon approach both outperforms the SRS in terms of both clear speed, quality of life, single target damage output, but most importantly, high-end ceiling of what you can do of upgrading the character. Now, before I go into the build, I do want to say a couple of quick things. First one, animate weapon is a very specific playstyle. A lot of people will very often prefer the playstyle of the SRS, which is one of the main reasons why it's so popular in the current state of the game, and I very much understand this. I personally don't agree with this, but it is very fair to point this out. The poison animate weapon compared to SRS, which I will be comparing a lot in this video, is on the lower budget, very little difference. The damage is a bit better, the defense is about the same, and as soon as you start investing into the character when you get into the higher end maps, or even yellow tier maps and red tier maps with this type of build, the difference will be bigger and more noticeable, and especially when you start saying that, hey, I'm going to start investing to this character and make it into a higher budget build because I'm having fun with it, then the difference between the SRS and animate weapon really shines. Now, this doesn't put any shade to the SRS build because it is a very good build. However, this guide and this video is covering the animate weapon. This build is utilizing the blade fall ability, which will generate lingering blades on the ground, which will then be able to summon as animate weapons. This allows you to not use any specific loot filters to drop weapons from enemies to use to summon your weapons with. You will simply create them yourself. The duration of these weapons is actually getting up to the point of 85.6 seconds. This means that in most maps, you don't have to resummon your weapons more than 2 times, whereas an SRS build will be having to summon your SRSs all the time between packs that you're clearing. But enough comparing it to the SRS build, let's talk about the poison animate weapon and how it actually looks in terms of performance. On the lower budget version, we have in a situation where the build will be simply focusing entirely around running with the animate weapons, and the utility minions that normally with lower budget mini builds acts as meat shields for you will not actually exist in this build. And this is because the animate weapons are actually being targeted by enemies and therefore they will be tanking. Besides this, the other animate minions we'll be running with is actually things like Spectres for utility minions, as well as Animate Guardian. And there's a couple of niche things that we can add to this, so just going to talk about that in this video as well. Otherwise, we'll be running very defensively instead of focusing on our offense, and we'll be obviously running a Golem that will be proccing our Feeding Frenzy. So that's the generic TLDR of the kind of guide. We'll be running a life recovery and block strategy, and the guide for low budget will be running with a tabula rasa. Outside of this, the build actually doesn't house any sort of cluster jewels, nor does it require any super expensive item to get going for this approach. And there, with this type of approach to the build and the budget, at a level 91 POB tree, we're going to be reaching a total DPS of about 2.5 up to 3 million Shaper DPS. Whilst having this, the effective HP pool of your character is actually very attractive. You'll be sitting at an EHP in POB ramping up to 160,000 EHP, so it is a very tanky build. What's really interesting when it comes to the animate weapon, or necromancers rather, when it comes to leveling, is the fact that there are so many options for you to run with. In the POB and in the written build guide, there will be leveling sections. There are 2 different variants of leveling this build, and one will be to actually use the build ability, which is animate weapon, as soon as you're able to. This is something I very much prefer when it comes to builds, and most specifically making build guides. This allows me to get a feeling for the build and also very noticeably see the differences as I'm progressing my levels, as well as getting better gear on the character as I'm leveling through the campaign. However, if you want to speed through the leveling approach for this build, you should be using a Spark, Pierce, and Onslaught during Act 1, which you can mule from the other classes, and be able to run with that all the way up with the Frost Bomb and Arcane Surge and a Freezing Pulse. And then later in Act 2, you'll be running, well, the end of Act 1 rather, actually picking up the Absolution. This is something that is covered in the POB section, whilst the written guide will be talking about using actually the Animate weapon from the start when you can, which requires you to create blades on the ground, but most importantly, it will be leveled once you get the Melee Splash, which is available to Necromancers to be purchased from Nessa in Act 1 after you've reached level 8 in the prison. So these are the sections in the POB outlining what you can do and the gems you can run when you're running with things like Absolution. This is not the meta way of leveling, but it is the best, smoothest way you can level because we're going to be running things like Herald of Purity. This makes you feel a lot safer when you're playing. Again, not the safest, also not the fastest, but it is the safest way to level, which I think is very, very good for new and newer players to go around with. Outside of that, we'll be looking at the low-budget endgame gem setup, as well as the gear and the actual tree. The tree section on the bottom left side, we can have some leveling trees going through the spell damage nodes. If you feel like you don't really care about this, you're going to go into minions as soon as you can. Just take the intelligence nodes instead. It's perfectly fine. If you want to speed zoom when you're leveling, you would take these nodes and respec them later once you get more respec points from the generic quests you'll be doing as you progress. The level 40 tree shows you that you're actually picking up increased effective offering. You can skip this if you want to, but I actually tend to personally pick it up myself. And we're running into the Lord of the Dead, the Enduring Bond. This will be used no matter if you're using the Absolution or the Animate weapon. The strategy, the trees will actually be the same. But we'll be using zombies when we're leveling as well, which is stated in the POB. And this is something we can enable once we have sacrifice. This will help them survive. And we can also get the convocation as the increased cooldown recovery, which will help you get them out of harm's way. And also increases your clear speed. Outside of that, we want to rush into Righteous Army and Redemption. This will significantly increase your damage and clear speed when you're leveling a build with a Necromancer. So this is a very straightforward generic tree that I tend to use for most of my Necromancers as I'm leveling. And I do want to point out that I tend to, in League start scenarios, pick up Command of Darkness as the first node. It is definitely not the best damage providing node, but it is giving you 30% to all elemental resistances. This not only helps yourself alleviate pressure from your resistances, because you will lose a bunch of resistances when you kill Kitava in Act 5, and again when you kill him in Act 10. Commander Darkness will therefore alleviate pressure on gear, because in Act 5, Act 6, it's a really big power spike in the game where resistances becomes very, very, very important. This will help you alleviate that pressure to keep that resistance high when it's needed. And that is something you need to think about rather early on. For example, in Act 1, you want to get some cold resistance before you reach Merville at the end boss of that act. And in Act 2, Lightning Rest is not a bad thing to have. Act 5, Act 6 is where you want to have both cold and lightning resistance, but then in Act 6, fire resistance becomes very important as well. And from there on, you want to be as close, if not on the actual resistance cap, of 75%. So we're going to start with Commander Darkness in this build, is what I'm trying to say. The next leveling part here is the level 60 tree. In this point, we have taken the most important damage nodes, and if we want to enable more auras, we'll be picking up the Sovereignty Aura Reservation nodes on the left-hand side, and now we're just going to pick up some actual life modifiers. These will come from Devotion as well as Tireless. I do want to point out that if you're feeling fine and your gear is supplying enough HP, it is actually rather preferable to go through the life and actually go in directly to Grave Pact if you are leveling with the Animate weapon, whereas the Absolution doesn't need the accuracy because they're casting spells, and therefore these damage nodes are just that, damage nodes. But for Animate weapon, this will actually make them actually never miss during the campaign leveling. The endgame tree is very straightforward. We're just going to start picking up some armor mastery for the Determination Reservation. We're going to go start getting some block. These nodes are very, very good to rush down to if your gear is lacking resistances and you're feeling like you're dying a lot in the campaign, because that should not be the case. So enough about the tree. The ascendancy nodes before we move on will, however, be that you will, on the second ascendancy, pick up a Mindless Aggression. The third ascendancy, this is the Merciless Lab. This is where you would like to, preferably, if possible, get a trigger-crafted weapon. This will allow you to have your offering be automated with a Desecrate and an offering skill inside that weapon. And that's when we pick up Mistress of Sacrifice. A very important thing to point out here is that if you are leveling with Animate weapon, you might want to use Mistress of Sacrifice as your second lab, because this increases the skill effect duration of the weapons as well. The last node, I do go for Bone Barrier. The reason I do this is actually for the sake of survivability for yourself, but also for your weapons. Like I mentioned earlier, they will actually be tanking the enemies. If you want to be more of a glass cannon and you feel like your gear is sufficient, you could go on natural strength, which will give your minions 30% of the physical damage added as extra chaos, which will significantly boost their damage, as you can see here on the screen. But again, I think that it would be very frustrating if you start having your weapons dying. Therefore, please do yourself the favor, pick up the bone barrier. Outside of this, we're going to be looking into the skills real quick, the animate weapon session. If you want to see the DPS that you are doing, there's a lot of things in the path of building that needs to be set accurately. First off, you click in the include full DPS to show this little window. The animate weapon, if you hover over it, you can see that with the current gear in this PUB, that is a level 22 animate weapon. And the third modifier from the bottom says maximum 15 weapons. That's why we set a count to 15 in here. If I set it to 1 and you look at the DPS, you can see how it drastically lowers the damage output. But we have 15 when we have all of our minions out. During the leveling with animate weapon, we don't really have enough chance to poison percent chance for them, so we normally use added damage effectiveness, which will be in the written guide. In the finished product, however, we will be using chance to poison support gem, minion damage, multi-strike for single target, which is changed for melee splash, and predator for single target, which is changed for either feeder frenzy or minion speed. It's a matter of personal preference. I tend to prefer the minion speed. A lot of people following this guide over the past couple of years have said that minion speed is, feeding frenzy have felt better, which is why that's in the guide. We do, however, want to make sure withering touch is there. This is very important because we want to make sure that they apply wither. Now, wither makes enemies take increased chaos damage, so this is crucial that this is on the weapon so that we can actually apply this in a comfortable way. Utility-wise, we have the Desecrate, Bone Offering, and Convocation. This is something you can have in your trigger weapon if you do have one early on. This is not a must. You can absolutely self-cast this because that's something we will be doing in the later stage in the higher budget versions of this build. Shield Charge, Fast Attacks, and then making sure you have either Frostblink or Flame Dash is very good. This setup with Shield Charge and Fast Attacks makes the build feel very comfortable to clear maps with. Utility minions, as mentioned before, these minions are very specifically set up to have minion HP. Now, I do have an Animate Guardian here, and if you look at the configuration in this little custom modifier tab, you can see that the Animate Guardian is listed. This is in the build guide as well in the written version, which also houses an in-depth description and a guide for how the Animate Guardian actually behaves in terms of the mechanics of it and how the gear works and other gear suggestions. The modifiers here is Leercast and Dying Breath. It's a helmet and a very cheap helmet. And the Dying Breath is a very cheap staff. Now, those will provide a total of 68% increased damage. And they will also increase the efficiency of your Despair, which I've manually edited into this custom modifier. I've also included the utility Spectres, but as you can see here in the custom modifier, I put a hashtag before which makes them not show up in the DPS. So if I were to take this modifier, this hashtag off, you can see the DPS went up. The reason I've done this is to avoid inflating my damage numbers because these don't have the damage buffs at all times. For example, the Pale Seraphim, which we'll be using here, actually only works for 50% of the time. There's a 4-second uptime with an 8-second cooldown, and the same thing goes for this as well, which is the approach that you get from the Arena Master. So which Spectres are we then using? Because we can have up to 3 Spectres depending on what you want to run. Now, normally I would run with an Arena Master and a Pale Seraphim, but also a Carnage Chieftain. What I have a tendency of doing is that it's a matter of personal preference, and the way you approach it is up to you. I like the Arena Master for a variety of reasons, and some people don't. I think that is the Spectre that you should not be changing around. The other Spectre, if you only have 2, should either be a Pale Seraphim or a Carnage Chieftain, but I've found it that the Pale Seraphim has a higher tendency of dying compared to the Carnage Chieftain, and don't ask me why, I have no idea, but I do believe it's because the Pale Seraphim seems to be a little bit more aggressive with the way it's using its mobility skill. The Carnage Chieftain generates 1 frenzy charge to your minions. Do keep in mind that that charge is not very likely to be sustained, which is why in the configuration I've only set my minions to have 1 charge to avoid, again, inflating my DPS. I have set that the enemy is poisoned. The amount of poison doesn't really matter here. It's just that the enemy is poisoned. And the Wither stacks will be hitting thanks to Withering Touch support gem. I've checked the Predator because there's a single target DPS output. We have Feeding Frenzy on one of our minions, and we have animated weapons from Lingering Blaze. I'll talk about that in a bit. So the Spell Echo setup that we could run in this here, this is stated in the written guide, and I have it in the POB, and I want to point that out very clearly in this video. The spell echo is if you're going to use a spectre called a Demon Harpy. This is stated in the written guide as well. Demon Harpy comes from the Beyond encounter similar to the Pale Seraphim. However, it does a Screech-like ability that ramps up a stacking increased physical damage taken, not chaos, physical damage taken, up to 50%. It is similar to specters such as the Primal Crushclaw from Harvest or Primal Rex Matriarch, which I'm sure some of you guys watching this video knows what they do because they are the equivalent version for lightning and cold. The Demon Harpy are for the physical damage. It is not 100% uptime, again. However, with a spell echo, you will actually be, with one specter of Demon Harpy, be as close as you can get to about 85-80% uptime of that debuff, which is a massive amount of damage. But since we are looking at scaling poison, it is not a significant damage upgrade to this specific build, but it does make a huge difference in terms of damage output either way. So keep that in mind. It is not a must to run this, but definitely something I would recommend looking into. The aura setup, like mentioned before, will be running Defiance Banner, Determination, Tempest Shield for the sake of defensive layers. The Tempest Shield allows us to be immune to shock. Our Pantheon will allow us to upgrade the Brine King to be immune to cold, and we can have this minor Pantheon give us a lower duration of ignites. This helps us with ailments or elemental ailments. Malevolence will be our only offensive scaling aura. This is increasing damage over time. Like I mentioned before, we will be focusing on poison with this specific build. We'll be running a Bladefall, which we link with Spell Cascade. It's not a must, but it makes it so that you don't have to cast the Bladefall several times to create the blades to summon your weapons in. To keep the mana cost down, make sure you use level 1 of this. And then we'll run a Carrion Golem with Feeding Frenzy to generate more minion damage. Obviously, you can change the Carrion Golem for a Stone Golem, but that will lower your damage output quite significantly. Outside of this, we'll be running a Despair in an unset ring. Again, if you decide to not run a Demon Harpy, you could actually skip the unset ring and get another minion ring, such as a Bone Ring, and then have your Convocation or your Despair in here, and you can have your Despair in your weapon. Completely up to you where you put this. This is just a rough display of what you could be running. So I did mention earlier in the configuration that they are animating from the Lingering Blades. And I know this video is about to be a little bit longer, but I'll try to keep myself as short as I can. So what's really important here with this one is the fact that Lingering Blades are in a situation where you are creating these blades from either Blade Vortex, Ethereal Knives, or Bladefall, which is what we're using in this case. And they will be a exact weapon is unknown, but should be similar to Glass Shank is what it's stating in POB. I have been able to get a verification and confirmation from GGG themselves that the weapon I have, which I've created in this POB, in the gear set for the item set called POB config set, there is a new item Glass Shank in here. I have been able to adjust the statistics and modifiers on this item manually to be exactly the Lingering Blades that we create in game. This allows us to get an accurate display of how much damage we're doing if you set the POB correctly. And I'm going to show you this in this video. I do want to point out, though, that the Animate Guardian POB is actually showcasing a higher budget version of the POB. Just by having this here doesn't do anything for the build, because you'd have to actually edit these modifiers into the custom modifiers section no matter what you do. So don't even bother this, but this showcases a higher budget version that I would recommend running, that I'm running in the currently for the high budget version. So in the low budget setup, what we would do is we would go to our animate weapon in the main skill, and then in here we would choose which gear set the animate weapon is using, and then choose the gear set that we have where this specific Glass Shank weapon that I've created is in. You can go to calculations and do the exact same thing and check the show minion stat here, and look at the minion and choose the gear set that is correct for that dagger, and this will allow you to see its accuracy rating, which you should always keep a keen eye on to make sure that that is 100%. When you're using attack minions, never allow yourself to have them have even the slightest chance of missing. In here, we'll have a 100% chance to poison on hit. This will be covered with the gear pieces. So to finalize this little gear section for the character in the video, I'm going to go show you the weapon. This is a generic +1 to level of all spell skills, or physical for that matter, or minion skills for that matter. All three will work for animate weapon. And you're able to verify this by looking here, and you can see that the tags are duration, minion, spell, and physical. So there's a lot of different tags that allows you to scale this, so a weapon doesn't have to be a convoking one. It can be a generic one-handed physical weapon. It doesn't matter as long as you get levels. Now, I know that high amount of increased minion damage would give you better POB numbers, But like I mentioned before, they will be tanking enemies, which means that you want to make sure that they get higher level. This will increase their accuracy rating, but most importantly, their survival. It also helps you increase the survival of your utility minions if you get something like a +1 to all spell or minion skill. A minion skill will be on the minion related ones. The shield itself, you can run a surrender. They were surprisingly cheap during 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum restart. However, you could always run a influence rare shield with life % recovery on block as well. Both will do fine. I just smacked in the surrender because of how cheap they were this league. This might be expensive in the future leagues. I don't know. I'm not a clairvoyant. However, if they are, look for a rare one with a % life recovery on block, preferably on an armor base because if we want to scale our defensive layers. The helmet in this low body POB is a generic helmet that has life on it. I even took an energy shield base to not give myself even more armor on this build to make sure that it's not getting bloated, if you will. However, having a helmet that gives plus level to all your minion skills with 1 level is significantly better and should definitely be the initial purchase that you go for. However, you can also go for a +2 level of minion skills, which will be even better. I am using a Tabula Rasa, which is something I tend to do in most of my low body builds. This is to show you that the build is actually performing with absolute dog shit gear. Obviously, you can purchase with the correct colors a corrupted 6-link chest on the market, which normally are very, very cheap, even on league start scenarios. That should be outperforming this drastically because of the fact that you get defensive layers. In the higher body version, we'll be using the Covenant, of course, which tends to cost a ton of currency during this league at least. And then the rest of the pieces is just gloves, armor, and life. The boots, armor preferably, with life and movement speed, very important on the boots. The amulet is where it's crucial to pick up as much stats as possible, but don't ever forget a decent amount of life roll on these items. So in here, we're covering the majority of our lack of dexterity, which is a common issue with minion builds that we're starving of both sockets, but also dexterity. In the POB, I'm actually only showcasing you a resistance ring and an unset ring with resistances and stats if need be. It would be recommended that the non-unset ring, or both if you're not in need of an unset ring like I mentioned earlier, would be bone rings. Now, bone rings would give you the possibility of getting modifiers such as increased minion life, increased minion damage, increased minion attack and cast speed, movement speed, on top of your own HP and resistances and or stats. So those would be significantly better, but again, I want to keep the budget down. Darkness of Throne, bread and butter for most mini builds. We're not going to stay away from that for low budget. Just get one. Like there's no reason to bitch and moan about this. Just get one. And in here, you want to make sure that every single jewel you have has flat HP. Super important. It's also important that you keep track of your accuracy rating of your minions. So if you are in need, you have 2 choices. You can get accuracy on your jewels. You can get accuracy by having higher level of the actual weapon. You can get accuracy from the offensive mastery, which I have actually picked up. There it is. Minion offensive mastery will allow you to get 250 accuracy rating for your minions. Very, very, very effective modifier to keep in mind if you're lacking any sort of accuracy for your minions. Outside of that, the flask, you can skip the Rumi's Concoction if you want to. And I would recommend that you use an Enduring Eternal Mana Flask. This helps alleviate mana pressure when you're resummoning your army. Other flask is the importance of a Quicksilver Flask as well as a Basalt Flask. And if you're not running a Granite Flask, you should replace it, the Rumi's Concoction, you should replace it with a blue version of a Granite Flask to further increase your armor to this juicy 30,000 plus, in this case 38,000 wearing a Tabula, because it increases your EHP very, very much. Outside of this, you obviously want to have an instant roll life flask that dispels bleed, such as a Seething Divine Life Flask, which you can benchcraft on the beasts in the menagerie for anti-bleed suffix. I do want to point out a couple things with this that can help you along the road of progressing this. When it comes to the initial upgrades and keeping track of your accuracy, the way you can do it to check your current character is to actually have POB open, and on your Path of Exile profile, in the Path of Exile website, you can go to your account settings and make your account not private. This doesn't mean that anyone gets access to it. It just means that people can see your characters on the website if they go to your profile. Then you can go to import/export and then type your account name. In my case, it's GHAZZY. So if you want to look at my characters, you can just search GHAZZY, click start, and it will import the character statuses, and then you choose which league. So in my case, we can take the Sanctum League, and we can take something as the Poison Animate weapon. Now, I'm currently in between low and medium budget, and I'll be re-gearing this tomorrow at the point of this recording. And if you then click import passive tree and jewels and delete the old jewels that's in the current POB, I will then click on that button and click import. And then I will take the items and skills and delete the equipment and skills that's currently in the game, or in the build, if you will. Now, if you do this, and then I go to the PoE config, you can see that the gear that was deleted was only the gear that was deleted in the gear set that I was showing. So now you can see that this character is now in a situation where this is what I have on my build. It is a level 94 character. This is the tree I'm running. These are the ascendancy nodes. These are the skills I'm using. And here's the animate weapon. If you right click this or click include full DPS, it will show up here on the left hand side. And I can verify that I have the correct weapon. I can also hover over and see that, hey, I have 21. Don't have many levels for it. It's 15 weapons. So we add 15 weapons. And then you can go through the configuration to make sure that all of these things are set. And you can see that I'm doing 10 million or 10.5 million Shaper DPS in the current build. Now, I know for a fact that I'm actually doing a little bit more damage than that, and that has to do with a couple of other things. But most importantly, the fact that Predator and Multi-Strike is in my off-slot weapons right now, and the current DPS you're seeing with this character is the DPS I have with my melee splash and minion speed. So if I were to disable those and show you the DPS output that I'm currently having, or if you're verifying your DPS that you have, you can definitely just do it this way. It's very, very simple. And don't forget to make sure that configurations are set. And I can see that my build without Spectres enabled and with one, they don't actually have that one. I do believe this is accurate, but just to quickly show you, you can actually verify the DPS you're doing this way. And I think it's very important that you practice this a lot, because it helps you a lot in the long run with how to verify issues with your build or find upgrades for your build. So to get to my point, in the calculation tab, make sure you choose your animate weapon. In this case, I have it right there. I have the correct weapon set, and I can see that I have 100% accuracy rating right there. It also says here that I have an exact amount of 3,591 accuracy rating, and I'm able to now fiddle around and play with this. So for example, let's see if I have the mastery. I do have the mastery. If I disable this, PoB doesn't say that I'm losing DPS. This now tells me that my character has more accuracy than it needs, and I therefore have a point wasted in my tree that gives me accuracy, which I will be adjusting. But then again, I'm going to upgrade my character tomorrow. So this is a good way for you to spot things that you might have missed, because this is not available in-game. You'll have to utilize Path of Building for this. It's a very good tool to practice with. Let's see if I have any accuracy rating on any of my other jewels. I do believe I have somewhere. There is some accuracy. So I will take this accuracy jewel off by clicking none and then see the calculation. And now you can see that I'm down to 2,500 accuracy and I only have 96% chance to hit. This is very, very bad. So obviously, perhaps if I enable that, would that be enough? It would not. Therefore, I can now say and tell that I do need the jewel or a low roll jewel and the minion offensive mastery to make sure that the accuracy is 100% chance. I do want to point out before I step away from this whole rant is that in here you will also see the poison chance. So in the gear section that we will be using, I'm going to go back to the original POB. In here, you'll see that we're using Darkness and Throne, which increase the effect of Socketed Abyss Jewels. They have life, but they also have an accuracy roll if needed. In this case, we have a modifier called minions have 15% chance to poison enemies on hit. Now, the way the game calculates this, quick TLDR, is that each jewel is calculated separately. So if you have a 15% jewel, that would be multiplied by 1.75, which results in 26.25. You have to calculate each jewel individually because decimals are rounded down in Path of Exile. So this is actually only 26% extra chance to poison on hit. The other jewel has 15 as well. That means that it's 26 plus 26. That's 52%. And in the skill section, chance to poison gives me 40% chance to poison on hit. That puts me at 92%. This means that I would need a third jewel with chance to poison on hit to make sure that I'm actually in a position where I have 100% chance to poison. Because we're scaling poison damage, it is equally important that we're always hitting as much as it's equally important that we have 100% chance to poison. Now, I know these things can be a little bit tricky to understand, but I'd rather make this video a little longer to make sure that you have all the info. These things are all covered in detail in the written guide. Do check it out in the link below. If you're watching this video at a later date than 3.20 Forbidden Sanctum League, this video might be outdated, and you should always look at the written guide because that will always be updated for every new league. And there will be a disclaimer, if not, at the very top there. So stay up to date there. You'll find all the PUBs, including higher budget versions. And a quick note on the higher budget versions, which is what I mentioned before, being able to compete with being able to outperform significantly compared to the SRS build is, for example, a medium budget version using the Covenant as well. We're going to run an Unancient Skull Helmet, United in Dream, Tri-Grip before White, which is only to allow you to do physical reflect maps, but also have increased single target damage output. There is no Anonymous Gaze in this PUB. The gear here is about 10 Divines last I checked, which was about the 9th of January, which was a Monday. And in the tree, no cluster, nothing, same thing with everything, same config, and the DPS is 21.9 million this way, which is insane because it is not having the specific set with the alt quality awakened gems such as awakened minion damage or awakened multi-strike. But if we do use a divergent version, this is a slightly higher body version, keep that in mind. I do want to point out that if you're running Ancient Skull, this is also one without a helmet enchant. They will take a lot of chaos damage when they crit, and they get 50% increased attack speed. It is insanely good helmet for damage. And if you take this helmet, which you should, it is crucial that you take Grave Intentions. These nodes here gives them HP, but most importantly, chaos resistances. If you're having issues with your weapons dying, even on the lower budget version, the Minion Defensive Mastery, which I've taken on the higher budget versions, there is an option to give them 8% plus to all maximum resistances. And again, I know this video is getting a bit long, but to give you a TLDR, the permanent minions such as Animate Weapon, Animate Guardian, or even Zombies, for example, they have a base Elemental Rest of 40% and a base Chaos Resistance of 20%. We are then also giving them Commander Darkness, which gives them 30%. Their initial cap is 75%, just like us players, which means that they have 70% Elemental Resistances. They can still be troublesome to keep alive versus very hard endgame content. We solve this by having an actual Bone Ring, because the Bone Ring's implicit allows you to get minion resistances, and they roll up to 15%. So if you take the 8% max resistance mastery, the cap will be 83, but you can give them up to 15 with one of these rings and be able to move that 70% elemental rest through the Commander Darkness and their base rest all the way up to 85 and they're capped. You don't ever have to have any modifiers or nodes anywhere that will give your minions rest. That is completely covered by one Bone Ring, your Ascendancy, and the actual minion themselves. But that's basically the gist of the mechanics. So the medium budget version is doing this, whereas the higher budget version, which I'll be playing very soon on stream, looks like this. There's a Meixsell version as well. But as you can see, the DPS is about 82.6 million, which is quite low, but that is because I added in the idea of making this build be as tanky as possible. Path of Building believes that this build is immortal. This is not true. This is the tankiest and most effective way that you can do the vast majority of minion builds in the game for highest end budget. I don't want to talk too much about it, but even if I disable my defensive flasks from the build, it tells me that I have 680,000 effective HP pool with this amount of damage. It's absolutely disgusting. 61.8 thousand armor, and if you go into a Mage-Blood set with this, if you want to go crazy, you can get 99,000 armor and still pull off 60 million Shaper, well, 59.2 million Shaper DPS. This amount of damage from a tanky build like this is absolutely disgusting. But without a Mage's Blood, the high budget build is obviously very expensive, mostly because of the amulet, thanks to the popularity of the alts uprising. I do want to point out the Charisma oil, though, in the low budget version before we end this video. The oil for charisma is over here. This costs you 2 golden oils and 1 opalescent. This oil can be very, very, very expensive. So I'm going to show you what happens if you can't afford it, or you just don't want to put it on that bad amulet that you started with. So I'm going to take away the anoint by doing this and saving that. And as you can see, I only have 8% unreserved mana. This will not work. We're going to solve this by looking at our aura setup and look at the DPS drop of disabling Malevolence entirely. By disabling Malevolence, it is not a significant damage drop. However, we are opening up a lot of aura or a lot of mana reservation for us. You can add things in this case, such as precision. This is not in the guide, but it's a small little neat trick you can do, because you can adjust the level of precision, because this will actually apply flat accuracy rating to you and nearby allies. Increased crit doesn't really matter too much, but the accuracy actually does. And it's a flat mana reservation, which allows you to level it higher the more mana you have available to reserve, which will then alleviate a lot of pressure and also skip out on the cost of oiling the charisma. Other oil choices, since we are using block, would be things like the Testudo node, which should be down here somewhere, unless I'm blind. There it is. Clear, sepia, and black. That should be very cheap. Gives you to make sure life from block, gives you a chance to block attack damage. And there are other modifiers, such as the generic block nodes and like Arcane Guarding, clear, teal, and black, that gives you block to spell damage. So there's tons of different types of defensive layers, but I'll be honest, I would probably just skip oiling the amulet altogether till I have a decent one that I want to put charisma on. But that's basically it, and this long ranty video is covered. I hope you guys have enjoyed this video and the guide, and if you do decide to play this, let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to check out the link in the descriptions to actually stay up to date if the guide has changed or anything. Always look at the written guide. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe for more content, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Till then, as always, stay safe, keep rocking.